Final Fantasy XIV is a one-of-a-kind story in gaming. A failed product that managed to revitalize itself and not merely survive, but surpass expectations and become perhaps the most acclaimed game in its genre. With every addition to the game, more and more people seem to be convinced of this, and with the release of the Shadowbringers expansion, that opinions climbed even higher, to the point that it's often included amongst the greatest games of all time. The praise for Final Fantasy XIV has been so overwhelming that an MMO agnostic such as me finally accepted that they had to experience it for themselves. This is no simple undertaking, however. The many improvements and additions to the game over the years have led many to admit that much of the earliest content isn't quite so special. Nevertheless, a new player must play through this content to reach the quote-unquote good stuff. There are methods to skip this content, but doing so would leave the player bereft of context and knowledge that's crucial to enjoying the game's narrative highlights. As such, I'm left with no choice but to play all 50 hours of the base game and its subsequent patches that lead into the first expansion, Heavensward, if I want to see what people have been gushing about all these years. There's one stipulation, however. In an effort to focus on the game's narrative and main story content, as well as to compare my playthrough to my experiences with other JRPGs, I'll be playing the game solo, as much as I'm allowed. I understand the appeal of an MMO is largely based on player interaction, but that's not what I'm looking for in this game. In a gesture towards fairness, I'll attempt to avoid any criticisms of mechanics that encourage players to find friends and play together, even if they hamper my enjoyment from a single player perspective. In this video, I'll be giving a comprehensive review of the base game of Final Fantasy XIV, titled A Realm Reborn, as well as patches 2.1 through 2.55. I'll be covering the game's story in full, as well as discussing gameplay, mechanics, and the general experience of playing through the game. The game begins, as you might expect, in character creation. Since I would be playing solo, I decided it would be best to play a damage class. I went with Dragoon since it seemed to be a bit less standard than the other jobs available at the start. An opening cutscene introduces the player to Hydaelyn, the planet the game takes place on, and more specifically Eorzea, the continent the player will be traveling. As I said before, Final Fantasy XIV was initially a catastrophic failure of a game. When Square Enix decided to revamp the game, they also decided to turn this failure into a literal catastrophe in the setting. 5 years prior to the start of the game, a great battle between the Eorzean Alliance and the Garlean Empire ended with the summoning of Bahamut, which devastated the whole continent. This event was the finale of their initial release of Final Fantasy XIV, and it's a genuine stroke of genius as a story hook for this new adventure. My choice of Dragoon earned me a prologue in Gridania, the setting's elven forest. Initially, I was disappointed that I would be spending the first few hours here instead of one of the two beautiful cities other jobs get to start in, but I came to prefer Gridania over both of them for reasons I'll discuss later. I'll waste no time in saying that the first 10 to 15 hours of Final Fantasy XIV were easily the least enjoyable. RPGs are often criticized for having slow starts, JRPGs especially, but this must be the slowest start I've played. The opening hours of the game are the most rote, basic fetch quests with theming as imaginative as "the squirrels in the forest are eating our supplies." The starting area is a series of thinly veiled excuses to offer the player tutorials on the game's many systems. It certainly serves its purpose, but it feels like the homework that it is. There are quests littered all over the map, and maybe some of them are interesting, but I stuck to the key path to get past the opening of balancing main story quests and guild quests. Main story quests are as the name describes, the quests that progress the game's central narrative, and guild quests are job-specific quests that will earn new combat abilities for your class and contain their own smaller narrative. Since I wanted to be a Dragoon, I first had to begin as a Lancer in the Lancer Guild. The story of the Lancer Guild is nothing too special. It follows a bit of a shonen anime story, with the guildmaster teaching your character the meaning of courage while a cool, white-haired renegade dark elf interrupts your lessons and forms a rivalry with you. The finale of the quest chain adds a bit of character to the Dark Elf, but he's gone and the quests are over before too long. Unfortunately, these were the most memorable moments of the Gridania opening. When the main story quests aren't mere excuses for tutorials, they're laying the groundwork of world building that's needed for the main story. This groundwork consists of introducing key concepts that'll be important for the rest of the game. These include ether, a life force similar to matter that's present in all living things, crystals, solid stones made of ether, and primals, ancient gods worshipped by the myriad beast tribes across Eorzea. It's not until late in the opening, when you encounter members of a secret organization called the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, that the story's main thrust becomes apparent. After one of many similar quests, your character is spoken to by the planet Heidelin herself, manifested as a large crystal. She gives the player the power of the Echo. The Echo allows one to see into the memories of others, living through flashbacks and learning information no one else could. Really, this is used as a quick and easy excuse for the writers to give context to events the player wasn't present for. Depending on the location of your prologue, you'll run into one of several members of the Scions, who inform you of the importance of the Echo and invite you to join their organization. You accept, and the real main story begins. What makes this opening such a chore is not just the dearth of narrative quality, but the structure of its gameplay as well. As with any RPG, the combat options you have at the start are severely limited. The flashy 8-man boss fights and rows of ability icons you might see in a screenshot of an MMO won't come until much later, leaving you with not much more than a basic combo and maybe a buff or two to carry you through the hours upon hours of boar hunts and treant fights. What really drags this opening section down, however, is travel. The maps are large and movement is slow. You have a sprint ability, but it only lasts a few seconds and has a long cooldown. There are mounts to ride that move much faster, but at this point you have to rent them, and they go away the second you get off. Fast travel exists in the form of Aetheryte, thankfully, but you need to make the trip to activate each crystal before you can travel to them. On top of that, traveling to Aetheryte costs gold, which, while plentiful later, is a bit more limited in the beginning. All this adds up to the fact that the majority of playtime in the prologue is spent just walking. The tedium of traveling is why I ultimately preferred Gridania to the other two starting zones, as Limsa Lominsa and Ul'dah are bustling cities built with complicated street layouts and verticality that Gridania mercifully lacks. In all of A Realm Reborn, I counted 175 total main story quests, if you include the guild and job quests. My final time upon reaching the credits was about 35 hours. The Gridania opening consisted of only 29 quests, yet it took me 10 hours. The glacial pace of travel at the start of Final Fantasy XIV made it so that a sixth of the game's content took me nearly a third of my playtime to complete. The slog of an opening, somehow, used to be worse. A few patches after the launch of Shadowbringers, Square Enix rebalanced A Realm Reborn, cutting and trimming quests and boosting experience gains to make the process of catching up as painless as possible, without cutting any of the scenes that are necessary for the main story. This is most certainly a good thing. Many, myself included, would never have thought to jump into the game if it stayed as it was before. However, sweeping changes like this are bound to have some side effects. With so much extra experience, you will be severely overleveled for almost the entirety of A Realm Reborn. It isn't too much of an issue, though. Many quests are instances that revert your level to a cap, ensuring there'll be some degree of challenge for the most important moments. Combat's also basic until level 30 when you start unlocking job skills, so encounters being swift to complete is largely a good thing. The downside to this only really rears its head in this opening. However basic they are, combat encounters are a welcome respite from the mindless walking, but being overleveled ensures that they're done as quickly as possible, leaving even more time for walking. This rebalancing was ultimately a really good idea, and I'm really happy that I waited until it was done to play the game, but it's interesting to notice the unintended side effects. Final Fantasy XIV's opening hours are dedicated to orienting the player to the game's setting and systems. The fact of the matter is, so is the rest of the game. A Realm Reborn is itself essentially a 30-hour prologue to the rest of the Final Fantasy XIV experience. It has a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, but it's a narrative that's determined to do little more than hit the hallmarks of the Final Fantasy series. Eorzea is under threat from the Garlean Empire, who have begun their advance on the land once again following the summoning of Bahamut 5 years prior. This war is fought by the Grand Companies of Eorzea, organizations that control 3 of the 4 large city-states that make up the continent. Together, they form the Eorzean Alliance, presenting a united front against the Garleans while maintaining their separate cultures. War isn't the only issue plaguing Eorzea, however. The lands between the cities are filled with many different beast tribes that consistently attack trade routes and push on the Grand Company's borders. On top of this, the beast tribes have ties to the primals, godlike beings connected to each tribe that are also famous Final Fantasy summons such as Ifrit and Shiva. If these tribes collect enough ether crystals, they can summon their primal. Combating this last threat is the primary goal of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, the secret organization that your character joins following the prologue. Upon joining the Scions, the game settles into a comfortable pattern. The main story from here on out is a series of quest lines that all follow this outline. A beast tribe is trying to summon their primal, you try to thwart them, but ultimately fail, and you must then defeat that primal. Until the final arc, the main story never deviates from this formula. It transparently favors function over substance, though it serves the function well. This structure serves three purposes: introducing the player to the culture of each city-state in Eorzea, highlighting the different members of the Scions, and serving the player a consistent helping of set-piece fights against the primals. Touring the city-states is the first sign of promise in the game's setting and narrative. Each city has an immediately recognizable culture, both in story and visuals. Limsa Lominsa is a port town with a history of housing pirates, a reputation that the Maelstrom Ground Company has been working hard to scrub away. Ul'dah is a desert oasis built on free market capitalism, with both the filthy rich and the dirt poor, and little in between, calling it home. It's also currently having a population crisis, with refugees from both the Calamity and Garlean's conquest coming to the land of splendor they've heard so much about. Gridania is perhaps the simplest of the city-states, living in harmony with nature. They're the only city-state to try and deal with the beast tribes diplomatically, though the results are less than stellar. The final city-state, and the only one that isn't part of the Alliance, is Ishgard, an insular nation of religious zealots who are preoccupied with their struggles against the draconic Dravanians. These lands offer visual variety while hitting many of the standards of a fantasy setting. Though the cities show promise of narrative depth, the story is not concerned with exploring them. Not much is offered beyond the short summary I gave here, as the goal of the Scions is not to engage in the politics of Eorzea. What of the Scions themselves, then? They essentially serve to be Final Fantasy XIV's equivalent of the JRPG party. There's a member of each playable race, and they each have a distinct personality to help them stand out. Regrettably, they follow the established pattern of A Realm Reborn being a surface-level introduction. With each new primal you fight, a new member of the Scions will act as your partner. This gives each member enough time to establish what archetype they are, but not enough time for much else. Minfilia is the dutiful leader, Y'shtola is mature and logical, Thancred is determined, Ida is freewheeling, Papalymo is no-nonsense, and Ariane is a scholar. They're pleasant enough as consistent friendly faces, but they're nowhere close to the JRPG party they're mimicking. Gameplay is clearly the primary concern of A Realm Reborn. Much like the prologue, many of the game's quests are excuses to introduce various gameplay and social systems while having the player map out the game world. Unlike the prologue, however, the game is much more fun from here on out. Natural RPG progression makes combat steadily more engaging as you have more and more tools at your disposal, as enemies grow more demanding in kind. This is where I was glad I chose a damage class like Dragoon. The more abilities I had, the faster I was dealing with enemies. What really turns the game towards enjoyable is the steady streamlining of travel. All the many issues and annoyances that made the prologue so plodding are eventually removed. Once you've played for a while, you'll have attuned to Aetheryte in most areas and have the goal to use them. Even if you need to go somewhere new, you'll have a mount of your own that you can summon any time. Quests that would take 10 minutes in the prologue take barely 2 minutes later on. I can say with certainty that this was the most satisfying form of progression in the game, and I know that it was only as satisfying as it was because it was so inconvenient at the start. Even so, I think travel could have been sped up a bit from the get-go and still maintain a satisfying progression. The one travel annoyance that maintains for all of A Realm Reborn is the Waking Sands. The Waking Sands is the base of the Scions, located in the basement of a building in Ul'dah. You return here constantly, so you might think there'd be an Aetheryte right outside. This is not the case. To reach the Waking Sands, you must first fast travel to Horizon and walk a full minute to the east. This doesn't sound too bad, but with the frequency with which you return here, it adds up quickly. Being so out of the way does sell the Waking Sands as a secret base somewhat, but I'm not sure the effect is worth the annoyance. All the travel and questing are a means to an end, a steady ramp leading to the main draw of any MMO, dungeons and bosses. To progress through the main story, you have to play dungeons, bosses, and raids that require other players. Luckily, The Duty Finder makes this incredibly easy for a solo player. You simply choose the dungeon you want to play, and the game will start a search for other players in the background, avoiding any pesky social interaction you might need to get people to play with you. This is where I regretted picking a damage class like Dragoon. Final Fantasy XIV follows a standard MMO team composition of damage classes, called DPS, healers, and tanks. DPS is in charge of dishing out as much damage as possible, healers heal the party, and tanks serve as shields taking the brunt of damage from enemies. A common issue with games that use this structure is that it's easier to come up with ways to deal damage than ways to heal and protect allies. This means that there will naturally be more damage classes to choose from, and by extension, more players playing DPS roles. Tanks and healers are in high demand, while DPS are dime a dozen. Each dungeon requires each role to be filled. As such, tank and healer players can find a group for a dungeon very quickly, while DPS players often have to wait much longer. As a Dragoon, I had wait times of up to 20 minutes for some dungeons. Unless you're averse to the playstyle, I'd recommend new players play a tank to have good damage output for questing, but short queue times for dungeons. Upon clearing your first dungeon, you'll quickly realize that this is what the game's really about. The core gameplay of Final Fantasy XIV, like many other MMOs, is based on learning the correct sequence of abilities for your class, known as a rotation, and executing it correctly. All the quests completed and enemies defeated outside of dungeons are merely opportunities for you to learn and practice this rotation. The dungeons are where executing it is actually important. Well, part of the dungeon anyway. Much of the dungeons will have standard fodder enemies that can be easily dispatched as long as everyone is somewhat following their role. It's the several bosses situated at key locations throughout that finally require accurate execution of your rotation to take out in a timely manner. The pinnacle of A Realm Reborn's gameplay and presentation are during the primal fights. The primals are not accompanied by a dungeon, instead being more involved boss fights that still require use of the Duty Finder to find a party. It's clear that most of the game's time and money went into these fights, and with good reason. Large fights like this are the main draw for MMO fans, and the prospect of fighting the famous summons from throughout the Final Fantasy franchise is probably the main draw for fans of the series. During these fights, everyone must be playing their roles to the best of their ability, nailing their rotation with as little downtime between actions as possible. Additionally, these bosses tend to have more complex mechanics. These mechanics largely manifest as high damage attacks with large areas of effect that have indicators on the ground as to where they will hit, or periods of invulnerability wherein players must interact with items, kill smaller enemies, or simply survive. Dungeons and bosses usually have unique items that can be rewarded upon completion, but earning them is not guaranteed. This encourages players to run these dungeons and bosses multiple times, learning the quickest path through the dungeons and the attack patterns and strategies for the bosses. Repeat the correct rotation, follow the correct route through the dungeon, and correctly respond to the boss's mechanics. Put all these elements together, and the design philosophy behind the gameplay becomes clear. Final Fantasy XIV is a game about learning and perfecting a prescribed sequence of inputs. Experimentation is not encouraged. There's a correct sequence of actions, there's a correct loadout of gear for your role. At the highest levels, deviation from your rotation or failure to respond to mechanics will not just get you killed, but may cause your whole party to fail. This is the other side of the coin for the term role-playing game. Whereas a single-player role-playing game might have you creating a role and inhabiting it as you see fit, a cooperative role-playing game like this requires you to fulfill a role and play it perfectly. It's an experience more akin to speedrunning or playing a rhythm game, focused on perfecting execution. It's rewarding, and it does a good job of instilling camaraderie with other players when everyone plays their part, but it's somewhat suffocating as a solo player. If you have no intention of playing with or making friends, this style of gameplay can feel pointless. If my personal expression through the mechanics only hinders me, why am I playing? Why not just watch an AI execute this sequence? This isn't necessarily a criticism of the design, more so an example of issues that you can run into if you try to make a game something it's not. This is a good opportunity to touch on the game's music. If you have any experience with the franchise, you know that Final Fantasy has incredible music, and this game more than keeps that tradition. A Realm Reborn alone has over 6 hours of music, and all of it is at least good. Most of the time, you'll hear the more unassuming songs as you traverse the cities and wilderness. They're good songs, though perhaps a bit forgettable, often sticking to the expected orchestral fantasy sound. The real showstoppers are saved for the primal fights, where all standards are thrown out the window. These songs meld the orchestra with electric bass, guitars, and synths to create some songs that are distinctly Final Fantasy. Some fights like Titan and Leviathan have full-on rock songs, immediately impressing upon the player that these fights stand out. The best example would have to be the fight with Shiva. It features a threatening orchestra backed by chanting befitting an Ice Queen, until Shiva freezes the battlefield, silencing the music, only to shatter the ice with a loud snap as the music explodes into a hyperactive rock song with full vocals. While the songs are great, I had to listen to them by themselves after I fought each primal to actually hear them. This is because the fights have 8 players firing off their abilities at once, with all the sounds that accompany that. If you want to hear the songs as you fight, you'll need to turn down all the sound effects beforehand. The Scions are focused on fighting the primals, but that doesn't mean the other threats sit idly by. At roughly 2/3 through A Realm Reborn, the story finally starts to ramp up. After defeating yet another primal, you head back to the Waking Sands. Upon reaching there, you find dead bodies all over, and all the Scions you know are missing. The Garlean Empire has begun to make its move, raiding the Waking Sands and capturing your friends while you were away. It turns out that the Empire has been the ones supplying the ether crystals to the beasts in an effort to summon the primals. Though you will still certainly fight a few more primals, stopping the Empire and rescuing your friends becomes the central objective. This moment represents a major shift in A Realm Reborn's story, as your purpose will be much more focused from here to the credits. This shift is heralded by the presence of Alphino. Alphino and his sister Alice were introduced much earlier, but it's not until the destruction of the Scions that he becomes a major player in the story. Alphino is the grandson of the founder of the Scions, a man who sacrificed himself to save many during the Calamity. Hearing of what befell the Scions spurred Alphino into action, recruiting you in an effort to rebuild the Scions from scratch. Alphino is Final Fantasy XIV's first good character. Whereas Minfilia did little more than delegate, Alphino becomes the de facto protagonist. His first impression is of a holier-than-thou rich kid with a passing affection for doing good. But as you work together to rebuild the Scions, he shows an immense capability for empathy and a strong sense of justice. His posh demeanor equips him well for the diplomacy he must invoke with the different Grand Company leaders, as he tries to accrue the resources necessary to fight the primals. His character doesn't progress much in A Realm Reborn itself, but he's a welcome active participant in the events of the story. Another central player emerges around this time, the engineer and series staple Cid. In this game, Cid was a former Garlean engineer who defected to the Eorzean Alliance when he realized the harm his country was doing. He was believed to have died in the Calamity, but you and Alphino find him without his memories in a church. Curiously, Cid is the only character that's given an arc in A Realm Reborn. In fact, after his introduction, the game seems just as concerned with developing Cid as it does with defeating the Garleans. This is a shame, because Cid as a character isn't very interesting. He's so uninteresting, in fact, that I took a long break in writing upon reaching this section because I couldn't muster the energy to talk about him. Cid's story concerns him regaining his memories and the resolve to stop the Garleans. If you've experienced any other story about memory loss before, then you can most likely guess the exact beats that Cid's story hits. He does at least manage to give some context and history to the Garlean Empire as he remembers who he was. Despite supposedly being the main antagonist of A Realm Reborn, the Garlean Empire only really factor into the story late in the game. They're everything you could expect from an evil empire in a Final Fantasy game, wielding technology that's beyond anyone in Eorzea, conquering lands under the pretense that a world under the control of their gifted people would bring peace. They show up here and there in the background, being a vague force of evil causing the primal awakenings for some reason. It's easy to assume that they just want to destabilize Eorzea, but in a refreshing twist for the story up to now, there's actually more to it. The leader of the Garleans, Gaius von Balesier, believes that humanity should rule the planet on their own, not bowing down to any gods. Using an ancient machine from a lost civilization, made with technology that's beyond even the Garleans, he hopes to rid the world of the primals once and for all. This machine, called the Ultima Weapon, can absorb the primals and harness their power. With it, Gaius can kill the gods he detests while also gaining the power necessary to conquer the world. A simple desire to rule the world would be in line with other elements of A Realm Reborn story, but it's nice the writers decided to include a bit more in this case. It just wouldn't be a Final Fantasy story if there wasn't a secret true villain, though. Accompanying the Garleans through much of the story is a dark mage hooded in a black cloak named La Habrea. Initially, he seems to just be some kind of advisor, but you later learn that he's actually a member of an ancient evil race known as the Ascians. It's really an unfortunate name for such an important element of the story. He assists the Garleans, but his true goal is to harness the Ultima Weapon's power for himself to resurrect his dark god. His intentions are only unveiled in the last hour of the game before the credits roll, and much like Cid's story, you could probably guess all of who he is the moment he's introduced. The final dungeon of the game, the Praetorium, is where Gaius and La Habrea's true goals are revealed. It's the longest and most involved sequence in the game by far. I'd love to praise this segment as an exciting climax, but it unfortunately proved to be the best example, or worst I guess, of the issues you can face while trying to experience A Realm Reborn as a solo player. The Praetorium is supposed to be a desperate fight through a Garlean stronghold punctuated with boss fights against Gaius' right-hand men that have been menacing presences throughout the whole game. This all works great in theory. It does not work in the reality in which this content is years old, and the players you group with run ahead of you, killing enemies and starting bosses before you can even catch up. In one particularly frustrating spot, the group boarded an elevator and rode it without me. This forced me to wait until someone came back and sent the elevator back down, but by that point, I was already a cutscene behind the others and had missed a boss fight. The credits roll upon completing the dungeon and watching a few more cutscenes, and while I would have loved to feel satisfaction upon completing the game, I was too busy feeling frustrated and disappointed with my experience in the Praetorium. A Realm Reborn is function over substance, a prolonged introduction of tutorials and world building that the developers hope to build on later. It rests on the conventions of the Final Fantasy series to give flavor to what would otherwise be bland. It has elemental crystals, an evil empire, a hidden true enemy, warriors of light, Moogles, Cid, Biggs and Wedge, summons, anything to convince the player that they are, in fact, playing a Final Fantasy game. It puts in a lot of work to establish Eorzea and its people, and it nails the gameplay standards of an MMORPG, though none of these things are expanded upon. Asking players to devote so much time into a game that's hardly compelling on its own might be unreasonable. The worth of A Realm Reborn rests entirely upon how quickly Square Enix builds on this foundation and the quality of what they build. I'm happy to say that Square Enix meaningfully built upon the foundation right away. The post-game patches that connect the base game to the first expansion are devoted entirely to adding substance to the ideas that A Realm Reborn established. With the outside threat of the Garlean Empire dealt with for now, the story can turn inward, fleshing out the cast and exploring the politics of Eorzea itself. Here is where the Scions begin to take shape as that JRPG party they're intended to be. Minfilia is the first to get some attention. Patch 2.1 largely focuses on her past, as you learn about her attachment to Ul'dah and the Waking Sands, as well as track down her lost foster mother. The details aren't mind-blowing, and don't really change the player's perception of Minfilia, but she feels more like a person after it. Y'shtola similarly stays consistent with what's previously known about her, but paired with some of the political events that take place in the patches, shows herself to be someone who isn't afraid to question those in power, even questioning assumed truths of Eorzea. Even Ariange, by far the most paper-thin character in the Scions, gets some nice characterization with his relationship with the new character, Moonbrida. Not every Scion's expanded upon, but with the increased characterization of the patches, I'm confident they will be later on. Alphinaud continues to be the standout of the cast. Refusing to stay content with rebuilding the Scions, Alphinaud takes it upon himself to push the organization to be more proactive in protecting Eorzea in more ways than just fighting the Primals. To accomplish this, he forms a new grand company of his own that he names the Crystal Braves. The Braves work in conjunction with the Scions as a more generalized military force, protecting the people of Eorzea while the Scions concern themselves with more specialized tasks. Alphinaud's already shown himself to be genuinely concerned with helping people, but the formation of the Crystal Braves and his push for helping Ishgard in the later patches exemplify his growing affection for the land. The negotiations with the Eorzean alliance, in which he tries to convince the Grand Companies to send forces to assist Ishgard, is a particular standout for his character, being the only time he lets his emotions get the best of him, as he angrily chastises the leaders for forsaking Ishgard. I hope Alphinaud continues to be a pseudo-protagonist going forward, as he's easily the most charming and admirable character thus far. A curious omission in the patches is Cid. Considering how much of focus he received in the later half of A Realm Reborn, I was quite surprised to find that he didn't appear in the main story quests at all. He does feature prominently in the Crystal Tower quest chain, which was retroactively made mandatory in the Shadowbringers expansion, but before that I wouldn't be surprised if players thought he disappeared for no reason. That being said, I didn't necessarily miss him. The real strength of the post-game patches, the elements that made me happy that I played and paid attention to A Realm Reborn, is the shift in narrative focus to the politics of Eorzea. A minor detail in the first patch was a tip-off to the quality increase in the story. Following the Scions' defeat of the Garleans and stopping of the Primals, the Grand Companies have begun trying to gain the organization's favor and break their neutrality. Alphinaud states that it was always curious that there was no aetheryte crystal near the Waking Sands, hypothesizing it was likely an effort to make the Scions feel uncomfortable in Ul'dah. They hoped that this would push the Scions to offer assistance to the city-state in exchange for aetheryte outside their headquarters. This one small comment recontextualizes the relationship the Scions had with the Alliance, painting their neutrality as well as the Alliance's unity as more precarious than previously assumed. On top of that, it ties gameplay and story together, as I was inconvenienced by the lack of aetheryte in the same way the Scions were. This comment happens in one of the first conversations of the post-game, immediately raising the bar for what Final Fantasy XIV will be doing with its world and story. The desire to remain neutral causes the Scions to move their base to the mercenary town of Mordona, a place that does have an aetheryte crystal right outside the headquarters, fixing the last travel annoyance I had with the game. Couple this with the new ability to fly on your mount, which lets you traverse even faster, and suddenly, I was excited to play Final Fantasy XIV. Ul'dah's troubles end up being the main focus of much of the post-game. The base game explained that the city was run by a council called the Syndicate, made up of the city's most powerful businessmen, the leader of the Immortal Flames Grand Company, and Ul'dah's monarch. This was window dressing in A Realm Reborn, but the post-game takes this and runs with it. Members of the Syndicate have begun making moves to consolidate power. The first sign of this is a violent refugee riot in which the poor refugees were curiously armed with military-grade weapons. Taking the only details of Ul'dah known up to this point, being full of rich opportunists and facing a refugee crisis, and having them play off each other, brings Ul'dah to life with complex politics that feel like a natural progression of the state of the city. This event even has repercussions that reverberate to the other areas of Eorzea. Refugees fleeing Ul'dah after the riot escaped to the forests of Gridania, encroaching upon the land of the formerly peaceful Sylvans and causing them to summon their primal. The refugee crisis finally boiling over also proves to be poor timing for the arriving Domans, a people escaping a Garlean Empire-ruled continent that landed in Ul'dah shortly after. This new slew of concerns within Eorzea itself has made each of the city-states unwilling or unable to give them refuge. The Scions eventually offer them a home in Mordona, but this is yet another sign that the Eorzean alliance's ties are weakening. The Domans bring with them news of the state of the Empire. Following the Emperor's death, there was a civil war over succession that put their conquests to a halt for some time. This matter of succession will soon be solved, however, and Eorzea is likely to face another invasion with even more anger after the killing of Gaius. On top of all this, primals have begun to appear again, but this time it's different. Groups that had no known primals are somehow summoning new ones. The Moogles, for instance, managed to summon an ancient Moogle king that had previously only existed in legend. A heretic sect from Ishgard summoned Shiva, another mythological figure known for being the first to bring together dragon and man. These new primals forced the Scions to question what a primal really is. This goes back and plays into hints from A Realm Reborn. Y'shtola had previously questioned the Grand Company's disdain for the Beast Tribes, arguing that their summoning of the primals was a reasonable response to the expansion into their lands. Gaius' disdain for the Primals extended to his low opinion of the Eorzeans. Many Eorzeans worship the 12, a pantheon of gods that to the Garleans are indistinguishable from the Primals. In fact, the reason so many were able to survive the Calamity was because Louis Soix, Alphinaud's grandfather and former leader of the Scions, was able to summon the 12 to counter Bahamut. If he was able to use ether and prayer to summon his god, how is that any different from the Primals? Y'shtola's statements skirted around outright accusations of racism, but as the truth of the Primals becomes more clear, the assumed superiority of the city-states over the beast tribes look more and more akin to the way the Garleans see Eorzea. Racial tensions continue to be a theme for the post-game content, as the later patches move on to the situation in Ishgard. Ishgard's reclusiveness made them stand out from the other city-states in A Realm Reborn, but it also felt as if Square Enix was deliberately setting them aside for later. That does seem to be the case, as Ishgard serves to be the focus of the first expansion, Heavensward. Patches 2.4 and 2.5 are the connecting tissue between the base game and the first expansion, introducing characters and lore that bring Ishgard up to the level of Gridania, Limsa and Ul'dah. The conflict with the draconic Dravanians comes to the forefront here, with Iceheart leading a heretic faction seeking to bring humans and dragons together. Though she is a clear villain, leading assaults on Ishgard in hopes of conquering the city for the dragons, her motivations are sympathetic when paired with the revelations concerning the Primals. Conclusions can't be made about much of what happens concerning Ishgard, since Heavensward focuses on it, but the potential is clear. Combat is perhaps the only area that the postgame doesn't wholeheartedly improve upon. Main story content caps out at level 50 before reaching Heavensward, as do the job quests that reward you with new skills. The boosted experience also goes away, meaning level ups are much, much less common. This all leaves the gameplay of the postgame feeling a bit like Final Fantasy XIV is spinning its wheels. It's not all bad though. The patches feature the best boss fights yet, built with mechanics that are more varied and demand more of the player than what came before. The fight with Shiva in particular is great, and not just because of the use of music discussed earlier. It has a lot of narrative weight, is visually impressive, and has much more of a challenge than the Primal fights in A Realm Reborn. Those old Primal fights also get remixed hard mode versions that make them much more intricate than their first encounters. Making these rematches arbitrary gates to continuing the main quest is a bit annoying for solo players, but they're at least satisfying from a gameplay perspective. Even if the gameplay stalls out a bit during the patches, I was too excited by the story developments to really notice. Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn is Square Enix doing all they can to fix the wrongs of their first launch of the game and convince fans to come back and stick with them. They did this by focusing on the essentials of both MMOs and Final Fantasy games, leaving iterating on those basics for later. The post-game to A Realm Reborn hits the ground running, taking a paper-thin Final Fantasy world and story and expanding it into one that I'm genuinely excited to continue experiencing. The growing mob of 14 fanatics makes sure that everyone knows that the expansions are where the real game begins. And if the jump in quality from here to Heavensward is the same as the jump from A Realm Reborn to the postgame, I think I'm in store for something truly special. I hope you enjoyed the video. If things go according to plan, I'll be making another video like this on Heavensward after completing it, and if that goes well, I'll do the same for the other expansions. Let me know in the comments if there's things I missed or things you wished I'd touched upon. Thanks for watching.